Yeah, I'm really glad to see all of you. And welcome to the closing session of what has been a great conference of the Left Forum, the largest conference ever. I don't know about you, but I've been here since sometimes Friday afternoon. I did go home to sleep a couple of times, and I went to lots of panels. I chaired a lot of panels, actually. And I'm so pleased. We have more people here than ever before. We have more young people here than ever before. We have lots of undergrads. We have high school students. We have lots of people who work in the communities. We have activists. And a lot of people who've come here for the first time. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit first, but just a little bit. And then, you won't believe this, but we're going to have Karl Marx here for real. Karl Marx is going to come out and perform for us. And then we're going to hear from Arundhati Roy. Can you imagine? And then Noam Chomsky is going to, as the program said, we, all of us, are dedicating this evening to a great grand man who was our comrade, who died in January, Howard Zinn. Howard was a beloved figure. He was my friend for, about 40 years. And I want to tell you why he was so admired and so loved by so many of us. First, and some historians don't know this yet, Howard Zinn was a great historian. He was a fine historian. He was part of a generation of historians who tried to redress the traditional emphasis that historians had placed not only on war and the affairs of state, but on princes, kings, presidents, legislatures. Howard, following in the footsteps of the British social historians who also studied the lives and political actions of ordinary people, Howard studied the lives and the magnificent moments when ordinary people burst into politics and reshaped the course of American history. Howard told us about American history from Columbus on to today, focusing on Native Americans, on slaves, on women, on labor protesters, on anti-war protesters, on civil rights protesters. His work was distinctive for its sweep, its lucidity, and you know, people learned how special it was. When that book first came out around 79 or 80, like a lot of books written by professors, it didn't have a big sale, but it had a kind of rolling motion. People who bought the book told other people who bought the book about the book. High school teachers who assigned the book told other high school teachers about the book, and undergraduate teachers. And in the end, the People's History of the United States sold over 2 million copies. And then came People's Voices. And you know, there's something else about Howard's work. It was living work in the sense that he revised it. It changed. There were a lot of editions of People's History. The first edition was full of empathy and compassion for the poor people, the working people, the underdogs of American history. But as he thought about it and wondered about it and revised that book, the stories, the accounts, the narrative changed. So not only were these people magnificent for their testimony to their experience and their environment, but they were magnificent also because they were changing the United States. Well, there was another facet to Howard that I think helps explain why he was so beloved. I certainly think it's why I loved him as a good friend, and that is that he didn't make a big fuss about his politics. He didn't say, "Look at me. Look at how courageous I am. Look at how hard I work. Look at the risks I take." He never said that. He did work hard. He did have courage. He did take risks, paid costs, but he was not a martyr. And you know why he was not a martyr? He was not a martyr. He did not think of himself for a moment as a martyr because he understood that he was having such a good time, that he was having such a good life, that the political life was the good life. You know, he took some knocks for his political activism, both at Spelman, where he was fired, and at Boston University, where John Silber froze his salary. But never was there the hint of martyrdom at Howard's recounting of these events. Howard understood that he was, in fact, blessed with the special joy of an engaged and politically active life, with the pleasures of solidarity and comradeship, with the exhilaration of exerting oneself and even risking something to make an imprint on one's community, one's society. Howard never pretended to be a hero. It wasn't exactly modesty. He knew he was living the good life and enjoying himself too much. With that, I want to turn the stage over to our own Karl Marx. Join me in welcoming him.
Thank God. An audience. Good of you to come. You weren't put off by all those people who said Marx is dead. Well, I am. And I'm not. That's dialectics for you. You might be wondering how I got here. Public transportation. I didn't want to return here. I wanted to return to Soho. That's where I lived in London. But a bureaucratic mix-up, and here I am. Soho, New York. Well, I always wanted to visit New York. Why have I returned? To clear my name. I've been reading your newspapers. They're all declaring that my ideas are dead. It's nothing new. These clowns have been saying this for over 160 years. Don't you wonder, why is it necessary to declare me dead again and again? Well, I've had it up to here. I asked for the right to come back for a short while. But I told you, there are rules. It's a bureaucracy. It is permitted to read, even to watch, not to travel. I protested, of course, and had some support. Socrates told them the untraveled life is not worth living. Gandhi fasted. Mother Jones threatened to picket. Buddha chanted, "Oh." Mark Twain even came to my defense in his own strange way. And the others kept quiet. My God, at this point, what have they got to lose? Yes, there too I have a reputation as a troublemaker. And there too, protest works. Finally, they said, all right, you can go. You can have an hour or so to speak your mind. But remember, no agitating. They do believe in freedom of speech, but within limits. They are liberals. So you can spread the word. Marx is back. But understand one thing. I am not a Marxist. I once said that to Pieper, and he almost croaked. I should tell you about Pieper. We were living in London at the time, Jenny and I, and the little ones. 2 dogs, 3 cats, 2 birds, hardly living, a little flat on Dean Street, right near where they dumped the city sewage. We were in London because I had been expelled from the continent, expelled from the Rhineland, yes, from my birthplace. I had done dangerous things. I was the editor of a newspaper, Die Rheinische Zeitung. Hardly revolutionary, although I suppose the most revolutionary act one can engage in is to tell the truth. You see, the police were arresting poor people for gathering firewood from the estates of the rich. I wrote an editorial protesting that. They decided to censor our newspaper. I wrote an editorial declaring there was no freedom of the press in Germany. They decided to prove me right. And they shut us down. Isn't that the way it is? You know, and then we became radical. Our final issue of Zeitung had a huge headline in red ink: Revolt. That annoyed the authorities. They ordered me out of the Rhineland. So we went to Paris. Where else do exiles go? Where else can you stay up all night and drink wine and tell lies about how revolutionary you were in the old country? Yes, if you're going to be in exile, be one in Paris. Paris was our honeymoon. Jenny found a tiny flat in the Latin Quarter. Heavenly months. Heavenly months. But soon, the word was out. From the German police to the Paris police. Seems the police develop an internationalist consciousness long before the workers. So we went to Belgium, expelled again, and then we came to London, where political refugees come from all over the world. The British are admirable for their tolerance and insufferable for their boasting about it. The doctors said the cough would go away in a few weeks. That was in 1858. So anyway, I was telling you about Pieper. You see, in London, the political refugees from the world marched in and out of our house. Pieper was one of them. He was a flatterer, a sycophant. He buzzed around me like a hornet. He would station himself 6 inches from me so that I could not evade him, and he would quote from my writings. I used to say, "Pieper, please do not quote me to myself." He had the audacity to say, thinking I would be pleased, that he would translate Das Kapital into English. The man could not speak 1 sentence of English without butchering it. English is a beautiful language. It is Shakespeare's language. If Shakespeare had heard Pieper speak one sentence of English, he would have taken poison. Jenny felt sorry for him. She used to like to invite him to our family dinners. One evening, he came over and he announced the formation of the Marxist Society of London. A Marxist society, I asked. What's that? He said, we meet every week to discuss another of your writings. We read aloud and examine sentence by sentence. That's why we call ourselves Marxists. We believe completely and wholeheartedly in everything you've ever written. Completely and wholeheartedly, I asked. Yes, and we would be honored, Herr Dr. Marx. He always called me Mr. Dr. Marx. I don't know. If you would address the next meeting of the Marxist Society. I cannot do that. Why not? Because I am not a Marxist. I didn't mind his bad English. Mine wasn't always so perfect. It was his way of thinking. He was an embarrassment. A satellite encircling my words, reflecting them to the world, but distorting them, and then defending the distortions like a fanatic, denouncing anyone who interpreted them differently. I used to say to Jenny, do you know what I fear most? She would say that the workers' revolution will never come. But I said, no. The revolution will come, but when it does, it will be taken over by men like Pieper. Flatterers when out of power, bullies and braggarts when holding power, dogmatists. They will speak for the proletariat. They will interpret my ideas for the world. They'll organize a new hierarchy, a new priesthood, with excommunications and indexes, inquisitions and firing squads, all in the name of communism. They'll divide the world between capitalist empires and communist empires. They'll muck up our beautiful dream. And it will take another revolution, maybe 2 or 3, to clean it up. That's what I fear. No, I was not going to have Pieper translate Das Kapital. It represented 15 years of work in the conditions of Soho, making my way every morning past the bodies of beggars sleeping amidst the sewage, and then to the British Museum, there with its magnificent library, reading until dusk, reading. Is there anything more boring than reading political economy? Writing political economy. Then home through the darkening streets, past the vendors calling out the prices of their wares, the veterans of the Crimean War, some blind, others without legs, begging for a penny in the noxious air. The poor smell of London, yes. Some of my critics, trying to minimize what went into Das Kapital, would say, as they always say about radical writers, oh, he must have had some dreadful personal experience. Yes. Yes. If you want to make much of it, I walk home through Soho, fuel the anger that went into Das Kapital. But I hear you saying, well, of course, that was then, over a century ago. Only then, Gesundheit. On my way here this morning, I walked through the streets of your city, surrounded by garbage, breathing foul air, past the bodies of men and women sleeping on the street, huddled against the cold. Instead of a lassie singing a ballad, I heard a voice in my ear. Some change, sir, for a cup of coffee. And you call this progress? Because you have motor cars, flying machines, 1,000 potions to make you smell better, and people sleeping on the street. An official report. Last year, the United States gross domestic product, yes, gross, it was $7,000 billion. Whew. Most impressive. Tell me, where is it? Who is profiting from it? Who is not? Less than 500 individuals control $2,000 billion in business assets. Are these individuals more noble, more hardworking, more valuable to society than the mother in the tenement, nursing 3 children through the winter without any money to pay the heating bill? Didn't you hear me say 160 years ago that capitalism would greatly increase the wealth of the world, but that wealth would be concentrated into fewer and fewer hands? Goldman Sachs. I'll say no more. Do you know the Oliver Goldsmith poem, The Deserted Village? Ill fares the land, to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. That's what I saw as I walked through the streets of your city. Buildings decaying, schools decaying, people decaying. But then I walked a bit farther, and I was suddenly surrounded by men of obvious wealth, women in jewels and furs. Suddenly I heard the sound of sirens. Was a crime being committed somewhere nearby? Was violence being done? Was somebody trying to take a part of the gross domestic product illegally from those who have stolen it legally? Oh, the wonders of the market system. Human beings reduced to commodities, their lives controlled by the super commodity money. The committee doesn't like that. No.
Not Karl Marx, but Brian Jones. Let's give him another hand. And now I'm really thrilled to introduce the well-known, well-loved, admired everywhere, Arundhati Roy.
Thank you for that. I actually wasn't really prepared to speak for long here, but I wanted to come and say that I loved Howard too, a great deal. And so did a lot of people far away in that other fake democracy called India. So when Howard died, it made so many people in so many parts of the world so sad. And really those were parts of solidarity which are subcutaneous. You know, even I was surprised at how many people knew him and knew his work. So the last time I spoke to him, it was just a few weeks before he died, and I said, Howard, I just wanted to tell you that I still have a crush on you. And he said, look, Arundhati, I take that sort of thing very seriously. But he died like a poet. He died swimming. Who could ask for more? I haven't been to the US for a long time. I certainly haven't been here since Change You Can Believe In came. So I wanted to just say a few words about what that kind of change looks like from my part of the world. Basically, obviously, the war in Iraq hasn't ended. The war in Afghanistan has expanded hugely. It's spilled into Pakistan, and it's having very, very serious effects in India. Actually, sitting there, it's almost impossible to believe that the US government has any idea what it's doing in Afghanistan. Does it have any idea what it means when it says Taliban? We must wipe out the Taliban. You can't, because the Taliban is not a group of people. The Taliban is an ideology, and you can't fire bullets at an ideology. So if you look at what's happening in that part of the world, it's interesting that from Afghanistan into Waziristan and the northwest of Pakistan, into all the tribal areas of India, which are known as the Red Corridor. Actually, what's happening is a tribal uprising, which in Afghanistan looks like and is a radical Islamist uprising. And in India, it's a radical left uprising. But the attack is for the same reason. The attack is the attack of the free market, and it's the attack of capitalism. It's being resisted in different ways, but this is the push that's coming. Before I came here, I spent almost 3 weeks in the forests of central India, where the Indian government has declared war against its own indigenous people, because in those forests are a lot of mineral wealth, which all the biggest mining companies in the world have signed up for. And I can't tell you what's going on there. It's a situation, the war that the Indian government calls the war Operation Green Hunt, and it's a hunt of tribal people who are living in the forest. Basically, the villages are being burnt, and in central India, something like 644 villages have been burnt, and something like 300,000 people are off the government radar. They're hiding in the forests, or they've migrated out of the forests. But it's what an Indian government report called the biggest land grab since Christopher Columbus. And all of this is being done in the name of the free market, in the name of growth, in the name of development. So it was sad, when, even though many of us are in some ways cynical people about elections, so I certainly am. But when Obama won the elections, even the most cynical of us could not help but be moved by the tears you saw in the eyes of people who had been through the civil rights movement and had been through history, the kind of history that, the kind of things they had fought against. So we were moved. Even our deeply cynical hearts were moved. So imagine how awful it was when he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he gave a speech there justifying war. And those same tears of those old black people were cut and pasted into the eyes of the most powerful people sitting in that Swedish academy, applauding him for justifying their war. And that war is what we have to find ways of opposing, you know. And the thing is that in places like Pakistan or in India, now it has come to a stage where none of us can oppose these things without suffering serious consequences. And I think that time is gone now, where you can call yourself a person who resists without inviting consequences. So I think all of us have to move into another stage now, where we are not frightened of the consequences. You know, it's not a question of just marching on a weekend or distributing stickers or labels. Because it really has come, I mean, we are really in a time where we have to dismantle the system. Somehow we have to dismantle it. And that can only happen when we lose the fear of consequences. In India, every day people are being killed. Every day it's happening that even organizations like the civil liberties organizations and the democratic rights organizations are now being called fronts for the Maoist parties. But the battle is on in those places. You know, the battle is on very seriously, and I hope that somehow it spreads to make international links, because today the biggest scam in the world is democracy. You know, the fact is that it is countries that call themselves democracies that are administering the most vicious military occupations. So you have Palestine, you have Iraq, you have Afghanistan, you have Kashmir. In Kashmir, there are 700,000 Indian troops supervising elections and calling them, and this is a country that calls itself a democracy. We have 100,000 farmers who've committed suicide in India over the last few years because of the push of the corporate free market. And of course, people much prefer farmers farmers committing suicide than to have to deal with suicide bombers. It's a much nicer thing. You can feel great pity for them, you know, or such a pity, but actually I think they're quite happy if poor people would somehow find a way of killing themselves or disappearing from the picture. So I won't say more, because I think everyone's come here to hear Noam speak, and I'm very honored to be here and to have said these few words to you. Thank you very much. Bye.
After the plenary, Arundhati will be in the foyer, ready to sign her books. There will be other books available for sale as well. And now the main speaker of the evening, a man we have come to revere for his intellect and his moral leadership, Noam Chomsky. Let's give him a hand.
One month ago, Joseph Andrew Stack crashed his small plane into an office building in Austin, Texas, hitting an IRS office, committing suicide. He left a manifesto explaining his actions. It was mostly ridiculed, but I think it deserves a lot better than that. Stack's manifesto traces the life history that led him to this final desperate act. The story begins when he was a teenage student living on a pittance in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, right near the heart of what was once a great industrial area. His neighbor, I'm mostly quoting now, his neighbor was a woman in her 80s, surviving on cat food, the widowed wife of a retired steel worker. Her husband had worked all his life in the steel mills of central Pennsylvania with promises from big business and the union that for the 30 years of his service, he would have a pension and medical care to look forward to in his retirement. Instead, he was one of the thousands who got nothing because the incompetent mill management and corrupt union, not to mention the government, raided the pension funds and stole their retirement. All she had was Social Security to live on. And Stack could have added that there are concerted and continuing efforts by the super rich and their political allies to take even that away on spurious grounds. Stack decided then that he couldn't trust big business and would strike out on his own, only to discover that he couldn't trust the government that cared nothing about people like him, but only about the rich and privileged. And he couldn't trust a legal system which, in his words, in which there are two interpretations for every law, one for the very rich and one for the rest of us. A government that leaves us with the joke we call the American medical system, including the drug and insurance companies that are murdering tens of thousands of people a year, with care rationed by wealth, not need, all in a social order in which a handful of thugs and plunderers can commit unthinkable atrocities, and when it's time for their gravy train to crash under the weight of their gluttony and overwhelming stupidity, the force of the full federal government has no difficulty coming to their aid within days, if not hours, and much more, which I won't repeat. Stack tells us that his desperate final act was an effort to join those who are willing to die for their freedom in the hope of awakening others from their torpor. It wouldn't surprise me if he had in mind the woman eating cat food who taught him about the real world when he was a teenager, and her husband's premature death. Her husband didn't literally commit suicide after having been discarded to the trash heap, but it's far from an isolated case, which we can add to the colossal toll of the institutional crimes of state capitalism. There are poignant studies of the indignation and the rage of those who have been cast aside as the state corporate programs of financialization and deindustrialization have closed plants and destroyed families and communities. These studies reveal the sense of acute betrayal on the part of working people who believed that they had fulfilled their duty to society in what they regard as a moral compact with business and government, only to discover that they had only been instruments for profit and power, truisms from which they had been carefully shielded by doctrinal institutions. There are striking similarities in the world's second largest economy. This has been investigated in a very penetrating study by Jingquan Li into Chinese labor. Li draws the close comparison between working class outrage and desperation in the decaying industrial sectors of the United States and the fury among workers in what she calls China's Rust Belt, the state socialist industrial center in the Northeast, and now abandoned by the state in favor of state capitalist development of the Southeast Sun Belt, as she calls it. In both regions, Lee finds massive labor protests, but different in character. In the Rust Belt, workers express the same sense of betrayal as their counterparts here, but in their case, betrayal of the Maoist principles of solidarity and dedication to development of the society that they had thought had been a moral compact, only to discover that whatever it was, it's now bitter fraud. In the Sun Belt, workers who lack that cultural tradition still rely on their home villages for support in family life. They denounce the failure of authorities to live up even to the minimal legal requirements of barely livable workplace conditions and payment of the pittance called salaries. According to official statistics, there were 58,000 mass incidents of protest in 2003 in just one province of the Rust Belt, with 3 million people participating. Some 30 to 40 million workers who were dropped from work units, quoting Lee, are plagued by a profound sense of insecurity, arousing rage and desperation around the country. And she expects that there's worse to come, as a looming crisis of landlessness in the countryside undermines the base for survival of the Sun Belt workers who don't even have a semblance of independent unions, while in the Rust Belt, there's nothing like the civil society support that exists to some extent here. Both Lee and the studies of the U.S. Rust Belt make it clear that we should not underestimate the depth of moral indignation that lies behind the bitterness about what is perceived to be the treachery of government and business power, acting exactly as we should expect them to, unfortunately. Something similar can be found in rural India. Their food consumption has sharply declined for the great majority since the neoliberal reforms were partially implemented, all of this amidst accolades for India's fabulous growth. And indeed, it is fabulous growth for some, though not for the rural areas where peasant suicides are increasing at about the same rate as the number of billionaires not far away. And in fact, not so attractive for the workers, American workers, who were transferred to India to reduce labor costs by IBM, which now has 3/4 of its workforce abroad. Business Week calls IBM the quintessential American company, which is quite appropriate. It became the global giant in computing thanks to the unwitting munificence of the US taxpayer, who also substantially funded the whole IT revolution on which IBM relies, along with most of the rest of the high-tech economy, mostly on the pretext that the Russians are coming. Now, IBM is paying them back. There's much excited talk these days about a great global shift of power, with speculation about whether or when China might displace the US as the dominant global power, along with India, which, if it happened, would mean that the global system would be returning to something like what it was before the European conquests. And indeed, their GDP growth has been spectacular, but there's a lot more to say about it. So if you take a look at the UN Human Development Index, basic measure of the health of the society, it turns out that India retains its place near the bottom. It's now 134th, slightly above Cambodia, below Laos and Tajikistan. Actually, it's dropped since the reforms began. China ranks 92nd, a bit above Jordan, and below the Dominican Republic and Iran. By comparison, Cuba, which has been under harsh US attack for 50 years, is ranked 52nd. It's the highest in Central America and the Caribbean, barely below the richest societies in South America. India and China also suffer from extremely high inequality, so well over 1 billion of their inhabitants fall far lower in the scale. Furthermore, an accurate accounting would go beyond conventional measures to include serious costs that China and India can't ignore for long, ecological, resource depletion, many others. These common speculations about a global shift of power, which you can read all over the front pages, disregard a crucial factor that's familiar to all of us. Nations divorced from the internal distribution of power are not the real actors in international affairs. That truism was brought to public attention by that incorrigible radical Adam Smith, who recognized that the principal architects of power in England were the owners of the society, in his day the merchants and manufacturers, and they made sure that policy would attend scrupulously to their interests, however grievous the impact on the people of England, and of course much worse, the victims of what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans abroad. The British crimes in India were the main concern of an old-fashioned conservative with moral values. To his modern worshippers, Smith's truisms are ridiculed as, quote, elaborate theories of how world history was being manipulated by shadowy corporatist imperialist networks. I'm quoting New York Times thinker David Brooks. It's one of the many illustrations of the intellectual and moral decline of what's called conservatism from the understanding of its heroes. Actually, in the interests of full disclosure, I should mention that I'm identified as the villain who adopts Adam Smith's heresy, as in fact I do. Well, bearing Smith's radical truism in mind, we can see that there is indeed a global shift of power, though not the one that occupies center stage. It's a shift from the global workforce to transnational capital, and it's been sharply escalating during the neoliberal years. The cost is substantial, including the Joe Stacks of the US, starving peasants in India, millions of protesting workers in China, where the labor share in income is declining even more rapidly than in most of the world. Martin Hart Landsberg's done quite important work on this, and he reviews how China is playing a leading role in the real global shift of power, not the one you read about in the newspapers. It's become kind of an assembly plant for a regional production system. Japan, Taiwan, other Asian economies export parts and components to China and provide China with most of the advanced technology that's used. There's been a lot of concern about the growing US trade deficit with China, but less noticed is the fact that the trade deficit with Japan and the rest of Asia has sharply declined as this new regional production system takes place. US manufacturers are following the same course, providing parts and components for China to assemble and export, mostly back to the US. For the financial institutions, the retail giants like, say, Walmart, ownership and management of manufacturing industries and sectors closely related to the nexus of power, all of this is heavenly, not for Joe Stack and many others like him. To understand the public mood, it's worthwhile to recall that the conventional use of GDP, gross domestic product, to measure economic growth is highly misleading. It's a highly ideological measure. There have been efforts to devise more realistic measures. One of them is called the General Progress Indicator. It subtracts from GDP expenditures that harm the public, and it adds the value of authentic benefits. Well, in the US, The general progress indicator has stagnated since the 1970s, although GDP has increased, the growth going into very few pockets. That result correlates with others. For example, the studies of social indicators, the standard measure of health of a society. Social indicators tracked economic growth until the mid-70s. Then they began to decline, and they reached the level of 1960. By the year 2000, it's the latest figures available. The United States is one of the very few countries that has no government inquiry into social indicators. The correlation with the financialization of the economy and neoliberal socioeconomic measures is pretty hard to miss, and it's not unique to the United States by any means. Now, it's true that there's nothing essentially new in the process of deindustrialization. Owners and managers naturally seek the lowest labor costs. Occasionally there are efforts to do otherwise. Henry Ford is the famous example, but his efforts were struck down by the courts long ago. So in fact, it's a legal obligation for corporate owners and managers to maximize profit. One means of doing this is shifting production. In earlier years, the shift was mostly internal, especially to the southern states. There, labor could be more harshly repressed, and major corporations like the first billion-dollar corporation, the U.S. Steel Corporation of the sainted philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, could also profit from the new slave labor force that was created by the criminalization of black life in the South after the end of Reconstruction in 1877. That's a core part of the American Industrial Revolution, which continued until the Second World War. That's actually being reproduced in part right now during the recent neoliberal period. The drug war is used as a pretext to drive the superfluous population, mostly black, back to the prisons, also providing a new supply of prison labor in state and private prisons, much of it in violation of international labor conventions. In fact, for many African Americans, since they were exported to the colonies, life has scarcely escaped the bonds of slavery, or sometimes worse. In the ultra-respectable Bulletin of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, we can read, I'm quoting, that the prison system in America has grown into a leviathan unmatched in human history, making the U.S. the home to the largest custodial infrastructure for the mass depredation of liberty to be found on the planet, mostly black, increasingly Hispanic. That's a product of the past 30 years, the neoliberal years, as is the fact that the United States, quoting again, leads the world not only in incarceration rates, but in executive compensation. I'm quoting a Harvard Business School professor who points out that this correlation, this is increasingly recognized to be linked, as is the fact that the United States is lagging far behind much of the world, particularly China, but also Europe, in developing green technologies. Well, it's easy to ridicule the ways in which Joe Stack and others like him articulate their concerns, which are very genuine and real. But it's far more appropriate to understand what lies behind their perceptions and actions, and particularly to ask ourselves why the radical imagination is failing to offer them a constructive path, while the center is very visibly not holding. And those who have real grievances are indeed being mobilized, but mobilized in ways that pose no slight danger to themselves and to the rest of us and to the world. Joe Stack's manifesto ends with two evocative sentences, which I'll read. The Communist Creed, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. The Capitalist Creed, from each according to his gullibility to each according to his greed. Stack minces no words about the Capitalist Creed. We can only speculate about what he meant by the communist creed that he counterposed to it. I think it's not unlikely that he saw it as an ideal with a genuine moral force. If that's so, it wouldn't be very surprising. Some of you may be old enough to recall a poll taken in 1976, the year of the bicentennial, in which people were given a list of statements and asked which ones they thought were in the Constitution. Well, at that time, no one had a clue what was in the Constitution. So the answer in the Constitution presumably meant so obviously correct that it must be in the Constitution. One statement that received a solid majority was Joe Stack's Communist Creed. Well, I qualified that comment with the phrase, "at that time." Today, a segment of the population memorizes and worships the Constitution, at least the words, if not the meaning. There was a Tea Party convention a week ago which produced a catechism for candidates. One requirement is that they must agree to scrap the tax code and replace it with one no longer than 4,543 words long. That's to match the length of the Constitution, unamended. Only some amendments share this holy status. One of them, the second, under the recent interpretation by the reactionaries of the Supreme Court. The First Amendment is suspect because of what it might be taken to imply about separation of church and state. According to the current version of conservatism, the U.S. is to be a Christian state, kind of like the Islamic Republic of Iran or the Jewish state of Israel. In that connection, incidentally, Golda Meir is listed in the Catechism as required learning for children, but no Hispanics. Well, along with normal racism, that reflects the very curious amalgam of extreme anti-Semitism and support for Israel among right-wing religious sectors. And such matters should not be lightly dismissed when we try to look ahead. Encouraging this anti-tax extremism that you see in the Tea Party movement is not as immediately suicidal as Joe Stack's desperate action, but it's suicidal nonetheless, for reasons that I don't have to elaborate. What's happening right now in California is a dramatic illustration. Right there, maybe one of the richest parts of the world, the world's greatest public education system is being systematically dismantled. And the Governor Schwarzenegger, says he'll have to eliminate state health and welfare programs unless the federal government forks over some $7 billion. And other governors are joining in. At the same time, a very powerful states' rights movement is taking shape, demanding that the federal government not intrude into our affairs. That's a nice illustration of what Orwell called doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory ideas in mind while believing both of them, which is practically a motto for the times. California's plight results in large part from anti-tax fanaticism, and that extends over much of the country. Well, encouraging anti-tax sentiment has long been a staple of the business propaganda that dominates the doctrinal system. So people must be indoctrinated to hate and fear the government for very good reasons. Of the existing power systems, the government is the only one that in principle, and sometimes in fact, is answerable to the public and can impose some constraints on the depredations of private power. The corollary to getting government off our back is groaning beneath the even greater weight of unaccountable private tyranny. So-called libertarians don't seem to see that that's what they're calling for. But business anti-government propaganda has to be nuanced. Business, of course, favors a very powerful state, which serves Adam Smith's principal architects, the owners of the society today, not merchants and manufacturers, but multinationals and financial institutions. Now, constructing this internally contradictory propaganda message is no easy task. So people have to be trained to hate and fear the deficit, which is a necessary means to stimulate the economy after its destruction at the hands of the dominant financial institutions and their cohorts in Washington. But at the same time, the population must favor the deficits. Almost half of them are attributable to the military budget, which is breaking records under Obama, and the rest of the deficit is predicted. What's predicted to overwhelm the budget is the cruel and hopelessly inefficient privatized healthcare system, which is a gift to insurance companies and big pharma. Well, that's a tricky propaganda task, but we can see it all the time. It's been carried out with pretty impressive success. One illustration is the public attitude towards April 15th, when tax returns are due. Well, let's put aside the thought of a much more free and just society and just have a look at this one. In a functioning democracy of the kind that formally exists, April 15th would be a day of celebration. We're coming together to implement programs that we've chosen. Here, it's a day of mourning. Some alien force is descending upon us to steal our hard-earned money. Well, that's one graphic indication of the success of the intense efforts of the highly class-conscious business community to win what its own publications call the everlasting battle for the minds of men. Another stunning illustration of the success of propaganda, which has considerable import for the future, is the cult of the great killer and torturer Ronald Reagan, one of the grand criminals of the modern era, who also he also had an unerring instinct for favoring the most brutal terrorists and murderers around the world, from Zia al-Haq and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and what's now called AFPAC, to the most dedicated killers in Central America, to the South African racists who killed an estimated 1.5 million people in the Reagan years, and had to be supported because they were under attack by Mandela's African National Congress, one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world, the Reaganites determined in 1988, and on with remarkable consistency. His grisly record was quickly expunged in favor of mythic constructions that would have impressed Kim Il-sung. Among other feats, he was anointed as the apostle of free markets, while raising protectionist barriers more than probably all other post-war presidents combined, and implementing massive government intervention in the economy. He was a great exponent of law and order, while he informed the business world that labor laws would not be enforced, so that illegal firing of union organizers tripled under his supervision. His hatred of working people was exceeded perhaps only by his contempt for the rich black women driving their limousines to collect their welfare checks. Well, there should be no need to continue with the record, but the outcome tells us quite a lot about the intellectual and moral culture in which we live. For President Obama, this monstrous creature was a transformative figure. If you go over to Stanford University's prestigious Hoover Institute, he's a colossus whose, I'm quoting, whose spirit seems to stride the country, watching us like a warm and friendly ghost. Well, painfully to record, many of the Joe Stacks whose lives he was ruining join in the adulation and hasten to shelter under the umbrella of the power and the violence that he symbolized. Now, all of this evokes memories of other days when the center did not hold, and they're worth thinking about. One example that should not be forgotten is the Weimar Republic. That was the peak of Western civilization in the sciences and the arts, also regarded as a model of democracy. Through the 1920s, the traditional liberal and conservative parties that had always governed the Reich entered into inexorable decline. That was well before the process was intensified by the Great Depression. The coalition that elected General Hindenburg in 1925 was not very different from the mass base that swept Hitler into office 8 years later, compelling Hindenburg, who was an aristocrat, to select as chancellor the little corporal, as he called him, that he detested. As late as 1928, the Nazis had less than 3% of the vote. 2 years later, the most respectable Berlin press was lamenting the sight, I'm quoting, of the many millions in this highly civilized country who had given their vote to the commonest, hollowest, and crudest charlatanism. The center was collapsing. The public was coming to despise the incessant wrangling of Weimar politics, the service of the traditional parties to powerful interests, and their failure to deal with popular grievances. They were being drawn to the forces that were upholding the grandeur of the nation and defending it against perceived threats in a revitalized, armed, unified state, which is going to march to a glorious future, led by the charismatic figure who, in his words, was carrying out the will of eternal providence, the creator of the universe. By May 1933, the Nazis had largely destroyed not only the traditional ruling parties, but even the large working class parties, Social Democrats and the Communists, which were quite strong, along with their very powerful associations. The Nazis declared May Day, 1933, to be a workers' holiday. That was something the left parties had never been able to achieve. In fact, many working people took part in the enormous patriotic demonstrations, more than 1 million people in what was called Red Berlin. They were joining farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, paramilitary forces, Christian organizations, athletic and riflery clubs, and the rest of the coalition that was taking shape as the center collapsed. By the onset of the war, perhaps 90% of Germans were marching with the brown shirts. Well, the world's too complex for history to repeat, but there are nevertheless lessons to keep in mind, and even memories. I'm just old enough to remember those chilling and ominous days of Germany's descent from decency to Nazi barbarism. I was quoting the distinguished scholar of German history, Fritz Stern, who tells us that he has the future of the United States in mind when he reviews what he calls a historic process in which resentment against a disenchanted secular world found deliverance in the ecstatic escape of unreason. If that sounds familiar, it is. This is one possible outcome of collapse of the center when the radical imagination, which in fact was quite powerful at that time, and nonetheless fell short. Well, the popular mood today here is complex in ways that are both hopeful and troubling. One illustration is the attitudes towards social spending on the part of people who identify themselves in polls as anti-government. It's a recent scholarly study which is kind of illuminating. It finds that by large majorities, they support, I'm quoting it, they support maintaining or expanding spending on Social Security, child care, and aid to poor people, and other social welfare measures, though support falls off significantly when it comes to aid to blacks and welfare recipients. Half of these anti-government extremists believe that spending is too little on assistance to the poor. In the population as a whole, majorities, in most cases substantial majorities, feel the government is spending too little to improve and protect the nation's health, and on Social Security, drug addiction, child care programs, and so on. Though again, there's an exception on aid for welfare and welfare recipients and blacks. That's probably a tribute to Reaganite thuggery, I suppose. Well, these results give some indication of what might be achieved by commitments that are even far short of the radical imagination, and also of some of the impediments that are going to have to be overcome for these and much more far-reaching purposes. The Massachusetts election last January, which undermined majority rule in the Senate, that gives some further insight into what can happen when the center does not hold, and those who believe in even limited measures of reform fail to reach the population. And the elections, as you know, were to fill the seat of the Senate's so-called liberal lion, Ted Kennedy. In that election, Scott Brown ran as the 41st vote against health care, which Kennedy had fought for throughout his political life. A majority, it turned out, opposed Obama's proposals, but primarily because they gave away too much to the insurance industry. And much the same is true nationally if you look at the polls on which the headlines are based. One interesting feature was the voting pattern among union members. It's Obama's natural constituency, you'd think. Most of them didn't bother to vote, but of those who did, a majority chose Brown. And union leaders and activists explained why. They said workers are angered at Obama's record generally, but particularly incensed over his stand on health care. One of them reported he didn't insist on a public option or a strong employer mandate to provide insurance. It was hard not to notice that the only issue on which he took a firm stand was taxing benefits for the health care that had been won by union struggles, retracting his campaign pledge. There was a massive infusion of funds from financial executives in the final days of the campaign. Now that's one part of a broader phenomenon which reveals dramatically why Joe Stack and others have every reason to be disgusted at the farce that they were taught to honor as democracy. Obama's primary constituency all along was financial institutions. Their power has increased enormously. Their share of corporate profits rose from a few percent in the 1970s to almost a third today. They preferred Obama to McCain, and they largely bought the election for him. And they expected to be rewarded, and they were. Don't have to go through the details. But a few months ago, responding to the rising anger of the Joe Stacks, Obama began to criticize the greedy bankers who'd been rescued by the public, and he even proposed some measures to constrain their excesses. Punishment for this deviation was swift. The major banks immediately announced very prominently, front page of the New York Times, that they would shift funding to Republicans if Obama persisted with his offensive rhetoric. And Obama heard the message. And within days, he informed the business press that bankers are fine guys, in his words, singling out the chairs of the two biggest banks, two biggest crooks, J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs. They got specific praise. And he assured the business world that, quoting him, "I, like most of the American people, don't begrudge people success or wealth, such as the huge bonuses and profits that are infuriating the public. That's part of the free market system," Obama continued, not inaccurately as free markets are interpreted in state capitalist doctrine. His retreat, however, was not in time to curb the flow of cash that gained the 41st seat. Well, in fairness, we should concede that the greedy bankers had a point. Their task is to maximize profit and market share. In fact, as I mentioned, that's their legal obligation. If they don't do it, they'll be replaced by somebody who will. These are institutional facts, as are the inherent market inefficiencies that require them to ignore what's called systemic risk. Know full well that that's likely to tank the economy, but such externalities, as they're called, are not their business. It's also unfair to accuse them of irrational exuberance. It's Alan Greenspan's phrase in his extremely brief departure from orthodoxy during the tech boom of the 90s. Their exuberance was not at all irrational. It was quite rational, in the knowledge that when it all collapses, they can flee to the shelter of the nanny state, clutching their copies of Hayek and Friedman and Ayn Rand. The same is true of the Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, and the rest of the business leaders who are running a huge propaganda campaign now to convince the public to dismiss concerns about anthropogenic global warming, and with great success. There's been a sharp decline in people who take it seriously. Those who believe in this liberal hoax, as it's called, have declined to about a third of the population. The executives who are dedicating themselves to this task know perfectly well that the hoax is very real and the prospects very grim, but they're fulfilling their institutional role. If they don't do it, somebody else will replace them who will. The fate of the species is another externality that they must ignore insofar as market systems prevail. So you can't criticize them. Returning, let's go back to the very instructive Massachusetts election. Turns out that the major factor in Brown's victory was voting patterns. In the affluent suburbs, the voting was high and enthusiastic. In the urban areas, which are heavily Democratic, the voting was low and apathetic. So the headlines were right to report that voters were sending Obama a message. The message was very clear. From the rich, the message was, we want even more than what you're doing for us. And from the rest, the message was Joe Stack's. In his words, the politicians are not in the least bit interested in me or in anything I have to say, though they're very much interested in the voices of the masters. Well, there was no doubt some impact of the populist image that was crafted by the PR machine. You know, Scott Brown, this is my truck, regular guy, all that stuff. But that appears to have been a secondary role. The popular anger is very real, and it's entirely understandable. With the banks thriving, thanks not only to the bailouts, but to all sorts of other benefits that they're getting from the nanny state, while the population remains in deep recession. Even official unemployment is at 10% actual, much higher. And in manufacturing industry, official unemployment is at the level of the Great Depression, 1 out of 6 unemployed. And very few prospects for recovering the kinds of jobs that are lost as the economy is being reshaped in the manner that with the global shift of power that I described. Well, national polls reveal much the same phenomenon. The latest one I've seen was just a couple of days ago, Wall Street Journal. It shows what they call a 21% enthusiasm gap between the parties, with 67% of Republicans saying they're very interested in the coming November elections, as compared with 46% of Democrats. There's also a major shift from the norm. There's a 10-point margin by which registered voters say they believe that Republicans are better at dealing with the economy. That's a combination of solid Republican, mostly quite affluent sector, and disillusioned Democrats who see what's happening, the Joe Stacks. Half of Americans would like to see every member of Congress defeated in the election, including their own representative. A very remarkable picture of it's a remarkable picture of how the center is not holding, and it evokes memories, which we shouldn't forget, some of which I mentioned. The public conception of democracy is almost as negative as the aspirations of the business world. Of course, they hate democracy naturally, but they're now lobbying very fiercely. One of their highest objectives is to ensure that even shareholders should have no say in choice of managers, let alone what are called stakeholders, workers in the community. That's out of the question. But to quote the Wall Street Journal, some liberals are seeking to find a fair position that straddles the divide between companies and shareholders. That's a very interesting phrase, the divide between companies and the people who own the companies, the shareholders. But they're right. They're recognizing the decision of the courts a century ago that the corporation should be identified with the management. The shareholders are irrelevant, just like the rest of the public. Well, it's true that there was a federal stimulus, and even though it was much too small, it did have an effect. It's estimated to have saved about 2 million jobs, according to the Congressional Budget Office. But the perception of the Joe Stacks that it was a bust has a basis. Over a third of government spending is by states, and the decline in state spending approximated the federal stimulus. So the aggregate fiscal expenditure stimulus was flat. There was no stimulus. That's according to a study, recent study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the standard source of economic information. Well, the center's clearly not holding, and those who are harmed are once again shooting themselves in the foot. The immediate consequence in Massachusetts was to provide another vote to block the appointment of a pro-union voice at the National Labor Relations Board, which has been virtually defunct since Reagan's successful war against working people. Well, that's what can be expected in the absence of constructive alternatives. Well, are there constructive alternatives? Take a look at the industrial heartland in Ohio, where General Motors, among others, continues to close plants. There's one of the few journalists in the United States who pays any attention to labor issues, Louis Uchitel of the New York Times. He reported recently from the scene of one recently closed plant. He writes that President Obama never sought to reopen the factory, even after the federal government became controlling shareholder in GM during the auto bailout, so they could do what they wanted. What Obama has done instead is to try to ease some of the pain by sending an ambassador as a salve for the community's wounds, offering hope, you remember that, and aid. The aid is suggestions which can't be implemented. And meanwhile, there's another ambassador who he doesn't mention, the Secretary of Transportation, Roy LaHood, and that other ambassador is in Spain. He's offering federal stimulus money to Spanish firms to produce the high-speed rail facilities that the U.S. badly needs, and that could surely be produced by the highly skilled workforce that's reduced to penury in Ohio, while Obama shuts down the factories. That's Joe Stack's experience in Harrisburg again. In 1999, LaHood, who was then a Republican congressman, introduced a bill that would have provided federal funding for transportation infrastructure. It would have authorized the Treasury to provide $72 billion a year in interest-free loans to state and local governments for capital investments. That includes investments in transportation infrastructure. And interestingly, his bill called for not borrowing the money, but using U.S. notes. That's much as Abraham Lincoln did to finance the Civil War and as FDR did during the Great Depression. Well, that was 1999. Today, LaHood is using federal stimulus money to obtain contracts in Spain for the same purpose. It's another sign of how the center has been disappearing in recent years, past 30 years. Well, the radical imagination should suggest an answer. The factory in question and many others could be taken over by the workforce with the support of That would, of course, require the support of the communities that are left desolate, and in fact the rest of us. And they could be converted to production of high-speed rail facilities and other badly needed goods. Now, I said radical imagination, but the idea is not particularly radical. In the 19th century, it was intuitively obvious to New England workers, quoting their papers, that those who work in the mills should own them. And the idea that wage labor differed from slavery only in that it was temporary, it was so common that it was even a slogan of Lincoln's Republican Party. Well, during the recent years of financialization and deindustrialization, there have been repeated efforts to implement worker and community takeover of closing plants. Few have succeeded, but not most. The ideas have immediate moral appeal to the affected workforce and the communities, and they should be quite feasible with sufficient public support, and they would be very far-reaching in their implications. Well, for the radical imagination to be rekindled and to lead the way out of this desert, what is needed is people who will work to sweep away the mists of carefully contrived delusion, reveal the stark reality, and also to be directly engaged in popular struggles that they sometimes help galvanize. So what is needed, in short, is the late Howard Zinn. Terrible loss. Well, there won't be another Howard Zinn, but we can take to heart his praise for the countless small actions of unknown people that lie at the roots of the great moments of history, the countless Joe Stacks who are destroying themselves and maybe the world when they could be leading the way to a better future. Thanks.
You've been listening to the final plenary session from the 2010 Left Forum, featuring Frances Fox Piven, Brian Jones, Arundhati Roy, and Noam Chomsky. To find out more about the Left Forum, please visit the Left Forum website at leftforum.org. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org. And write to us with your questions and comments at pdxjustice@riseup.net. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.
That brings this year's Left Forum Conference to a close. I hope you had a good time. I hope you argued. I hope you contributed. I hope you go back home to your communities, your workplaces, and you do good politics. And we'll see you next year. Yeah, I'm really glad to see all of you. And welcome to the closing session of what has been a great conference of the Left Forum, the largest conference ever. I don't know about you, but I've been here since sometimes Friday afternoon. I did go home to sleep a couple of times, and I went to lots of panels. I chaired a lot of panels, actually, and I'm so pleased. We have more people here than ever before. We have more young people here than ever before. We have lots of undergrads, we have high school students, we have lots of people who work in the communities, we have activists, and a lot of people who've come here for the first time. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit first, but just a little bit, and then, you won't believe this, but we're going to have Karl Marx here, for real. Karl Marx is going to come out and perform for us, and then we're going to hear from Arundhati Roy. Can you imagine? And then Noam Chomsky is going to, as the program said, we, all of us, are dedicating this evening to a great, grand man who was our comrade, who died in January, Howard Zinn. Something else about Howard's work. It was living work in the sense that he revised it. It changed. There were a lot of editions of people's history. The first edition was full of empathy and compassion for the poor people, the working people, the underdogs of American history. But as he thought about it and wondered about it and revised that book, the stories, the accounts, the narrative changed. So not only were these people magnificent for their testimony to their experience and their environment, but they were magnificent also because they were changing the United States. Well, there was another facet to Howard that I think helps explain why he was so beloved. I certainly think it's why I loved him as a good friend, and that is that he didn't make a big fuss about his politics. He didn't say, look at me, look at how courageous I am, look at how hard I work, look at the risks I take. He never said that. He did work hard. He did have courage. He did take risks, paid costs, but he was not a martyr. And you know why he was not a martyr? He was not a martyr. He did not think of himself for a moment as a martyr because he understood that he was having such a good time, that he was having such a good life, that the political life was the good life. You know, he took some knocks for his political activism, both at Spelman, where he was fired, and at Boston University, where John Silber froze his salary. But never was there the hint of martyrdom at Howard's recounting of these events. Howard understood that he was, in fact, blessed with the special joy of an engaged and politically active life, with the pleasures of
Democracy. It is permitted to read, even to watch, not to travel. I protested, of course, and had some support. Socrates told them the untraveled life is not worth living. Gandhi fasted. Mother Jones threatened to picket. Buddha chanted, "Oh." Mark Twain even came to my defense in his own strange way. And the others kept quiet. My God, at this point, what have they got to lose? Yes, there too I have a reputation as a troublemaker. And there too, protest works. Finally, they said, "All right, you can go. You can have an hour or so to speak your mind. But remember, no agitating." They do believe in freedom of speech, but within limits. They are liberals. So you can spread the word. Marx is back. But understand one thing. I am not a Marxist. I once said that to Pieper, and he almost croaked. I should tell you about Pieper. We were living in London at the time, Jenny and I and the little ones, 2 dogs, 3 cats, 2 birds, hardly living, a little flat on Dean Street, right near where they dumped the city sewage. We were in London because I had been expelled from the continent, expelled from the Rhineland, yes, from my birthplace. I had done dangerous things. I was the editor of a newspaper, Die Rheinische Zeitung. Hardly revolutionary, although I suppose the most revolutionary act one can engage in is to tell the truth. You see, the police were arresting poor people for gathering firewood from the estates of the rich. I wrote an editorial protesting that. They decided to censor our newspaper. I wrote an editorial declaring there was no freedom of the press in Germany. They decided to prove me right. And they shut us down. Isn't that the way it is? Then we became radical. Our final issue of Zeitung had a huge headline in red ink: "Revolt." That annoyed the authorities. They ordered me out of the Rhineland. So we went to Paris. Where else do exiles go? Where else?
Howard was a beloved figure. He was my friend for, about 40 years. And I want to tell you why he was so admired and so loved by so many of us. First, and some historians don't know this yet, Howard Zinn was a great historian. He was a fine historian. He was part of a generation of historians who tried to redress the traditional emphasis that historians had placed not only on war and the affairs of state, but on princes, kings, presidents, legislatures. Howard, following in the footsteps of the British social historians who also studied the lives and political actions of ordinary people, Howard studied the lives and the magnificent moments when ordinary people burst into politics and reshaped the course of American history. Howard told us about American history from Columbus on to today, focusing on Native Americans, on slaves, on women, on labor protesters, on anti-war protesters, on civil rights protesters. His work was distinctive for its sweep, its lucidity, and people learned how special it was. When that book first came out around 79 or 80, like a lot of books written by professors, it didn't have a big sale, but it had a kind of rolling motion. People who bought the book told other people who bought the book about the book. High school teachers who assigned the book told other high school teachers about the book, and undergraduate teachers. And in the end, the People's History of the United States sold over 2 million copies. And then came People's Voices. And you know, there's something solidarity and comradeship with the exhilaration of exerting oneself and even risking something to make an imprint on one's community, one's society. Howard never pretended to be a hero. It wasn't exactly modesty. He knew he was living the good life and enjoying himself too much. With that, I want to turn the stage over to our own Karl Marx. Join me in welcoming him.
Thank God. An audience. Good of you to come. You weren't put off by all those people who said Marx is dead. Well, I am. And I'm not. That's dialectics for you. You might be wondering how I got here. Public transportation. I didn't want to return here. I wanted to return to Soho. That's where I lived in London. But a bureaucratic mix-up. And here I am. Soho, New York. Well, I always wanted to visit New York. Why have I returned? To clear my name. I've been reading your newspapers. They're all declaring that my ideas are dead. It's nothing new. These clowns have been saying this for over 160 years. Don't you wonder, why is it necessary to declare me dead again and again? Well, I've had it up to here. I asked for the right to come back for a short while. But I told you, there are rules. It's a bureaucracy.